from your perspective, do you see a consciousness shift coming in where we can maybe more people experience the reality that you're experiencing to be able to access these different states, or anything along those lines, right? We hear, words about evolution or expanded consciousness. Do you see that coming down the pipe for humanity as a whole?
I do. I see some big changes coming in what I would call the near future. Of course, when you're talking about consciousness evolution, that's measured in millennia and centuries, But so when I say in the near term, though, I'm talking about as near as maybe a couple of decades. Maybe within a couple of decades. Certainly within 3 or 4 or 5 decades, but I'm hoping within 1 or 2, we're going to have a major shift in awareness. And I think what's going to drive that shift in awareness, this will be surprising to you, I suspect, and the listeners, is physics. Physics is going to be the driver, you see. And why is that? Well, I call the physicists the high priests of Western culture. Physicists now replace the high priests. You see, we had high priests a long time ago, and the high priest's job is to tell everybody else what to believe. What's true and what's not true? Well, that's what the scientists do today. Scientists tell us what to believe, what's true and what's not true. If the scientists say, oh, that's bogus, well, then that's it. It's bogus, and most everybody will believe that that's bogus and so on. So scientists are now the new high priests. And this idea of virtual reality that I was talking about, and I told you earlier that it does better physics. Well, that's true. It does better physics so well and so much that physicists all over this planet are starting to see that virtual reality is the only thing that will answer the experiments, the only thing that will explain the experiments. Again, more and more experiments going on, and you just can't explain them with a materialistic viewpoint. It doesn't work. It's a bad theory. You can explain them with a virtual reality viewpoint. You see, understanding just what we went through, consciousness is fundamental and so on. If you have that viewpoint, then you can understand these experiments. So physicists are picking up on that. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I came out with my books, me and a handful of other people thought virtual reality was a good idea. Now there's thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, most of them are physicists, that think virtual reality is a good idea. And it's not because that's a becoming fad, it's because nothing else works as well. So here's the kind of the paradigm shifts that are coming as I see it. When physics gets to the point that they say, we're living in a virtual reality, and here's all the experiments that show that that's it, and that becomes a fact, you see, because physics tells us facts. When living in a virtual reality becomes a fact, then that will be like throwing a hand grenade under the, in the tent. That is going to change everything. One, they're the high priests, so everybody will believe that. Secondly, even a 3-year-old will have enough logic to say, well, where's the computer? Who's the programmer? Where's this virtual reality come from? You see, virtual reality has to be outside of the reality. So as soon as physicists say this is a virtual reality just because their physics experiments tell them that, everybody else is going to look at that and say, well, wait a minute, who's the programmer? Where's the computer? The physicists won't actually, well, they do know it, but they'll try to downplay that. But what they're saying is that our reality is computed someplace else. There's a higher level of existence than us. You see? Now, that's a big deal coming from the mouth of physicists. That changes everything. And when they change that, this idea about, who's the programmer? Because they won't think of this as a not programmed reality, an evolved reality instead of programmed. People will think of a programmer. Right away, you're going to have a bunch of religious people jumping on board that boat saying, my God's the best programmer. No, my God's the best programmer. We're going to get into, that sort of thing. But if we have enough sense to get through that and say, this isn't about a programmer, this is consciousness is the programmer. consciousness, actually, this is an evolved reality, not a programmed one. We've got a big digital bang, not a physical bang. We've got initial conditions of a small ball of plasma under high temperature and high pressure. And when we hit the run button, it's going to change according to the rule set. It expands, it cools, we get suns, we planets. We've been through all that Big Bang theory, and that's just a simulation. So when we see that, then we won't, we'll realize that this is this consciousness system isn't a supernatural system. It's just a natural system trying to survive, like all things do. And it has to do that by lowering entropy, which means love, cooperation, peace, that sort of thing. So if we get that picture, and the high priests of science tell us that there is this other realm that we are a subset of. There is some superset in which the computer lives and in which our awareness exists. Well, that's a big step forward. Suddenly, that's going to blow the doors wide open. You see, we could devolve into a religious war again, whose God's the better programmer. That would be unfortunate. That's to get stuck in that nonsense, would be unfortunate. But hopefully we won't. Hopefully we will be aware enough to realize that, yes, this is a bigger reality. Yes, there's been lots of people telling us that for a very long time. Now we can look back to the Buddha and to all the ascended masters. A lot of others have been explaining this to us for, the last 2,500 years. And we can put two to two together and things will start to look like there's a bigger picture. See, right now, the picture is just this physical universe. That's the whole picture. There is no other picture. Well, once that becomes not true, because this is a virtual reality, virtual realities have to have a bigger picture. They don't compute themselves. Then you see it kind of blows the whole thing apart. Now it's not a matter of religion versus science anymore. Science is saying, yeah, really, we're in a subset. There's a superset that makes all this work. So that puts us in a whole different state altogether. And hopefully in a decade or so, we can kind of absorb all that and figure out, well, what does this really mean to us? And hopefully, if there's enough people on the planet that do see a bigger picture, we can kind of steer it to a more productive result rather than regressing into religious wars. You see, I don't think we'll do that. I believe we're maybe smart enough now that we won't take that path, although there will be those who will try to push us to that path, and there will be those that will flock to that path because that's where belief takes you. That's where fear takes you. But hopefully there'll be enough that we won't stay there long or we won't go there at all. And when people understand the nature of a virtual reality and understand that consciousness is the computer, the next paradigm shift is, well, if consciousness is computer, then love is the answer. That's what we're here about. Once they understand what consciousness is, the fact that love is the answer is the next logical step after that. So I see that our technology and our science and our internet are all going to play a big role in this. You see, we've had these little bubbles of enlightenment, let's call them, for centuries, for millennia, all over. But they've all been isolated. Okay, the Buddha and his little group, they started a big movement that's still chugging along today with millions of adherents, but still, it's all isolated. They're all isolated within their own areas, geographically, within their own languages. It's not worldwide. It's not collective. There's bigger groups that say, nonsense. It's a lot of belief baloney. We don't have to go there. What we need to do is make more money. We have a lot of that going on. But when we have an internet now, all these little bubbles of enlightenment are starting to feed each other. See, you talk to me about several of these things that you probably are aware of because there's an internet. Otherwise, you'd have had to go down to a library someplace and look all this stuff up. Well, that didn't happen. The reason you know this is because there's an internet. You're aware of these things. You're aware of, maybe Krishnamurti. Maybe you know who that is. You're aware of the Sufis, and you're aware of, it all starts to work together because we have an internet. We have this big awareness going on now. So it's not going to be so easy for the people to say, oh, my God's the better programmer, everybody follow me, you see, because a lot of people are going to have a bigger picture than that now. So because we have the internet, because all these bubbles of enlightenment feed each other, can cooperatively feed each other, and when we have the high priests tell us in no uncertain terms that we're a subset of something larger, and that larger thing is non-physical, well, stuff's going to happen. See, we've got all the right ingredients. So for the first time ever in the history of humanity, we have all the pieces together. We've got the high priest telling us that there's a higher thing. Well, yes, but now it's science. It's not just a belief-based thing. Yeah, okay, but you got to believe what I believe if you're going to get on my train. Now it's not about believing anything. Belief is irrelevant. This is science. There's this higher order existence. That's a science. It's not belief. Everybody can come to this party. You don't have to believe anything or swear or make a creed or donate money, a tenth of your income every year or anything. It's science. It's there for everyone, and we're all plugged in to all the bigger picture stuff that's around for everybody to come to. So yes, I see that as being the first time in the history of mankind have we had all the pieces together. We got it wouldn't work without the internet. Even if all the scientists said, yea, verily, we live in a virtual reality and we're just a subset. If there was no internet, well, 100 people would know. 10 years later, 200 people would know, and oh, yeah, they printed in their journals and things and whatever. And it would be, yeah, okay, they say that, but they probably don't know what they're talking about. It wouldn't be what it can be because we've got an internet. So we've got an internet that lets us communicate worldwide instantly. Wow, that's a powerful tool. And we're going to have science that has become the high priest that everybody believes because that's just rational stuff. That's not belief stuff. But you can bet on that. That's experiments backing that up, you see. So we've got all of that. Never happened before in the history of man that we had these things all together at the same time. So yes, in another decade, this thing could do that. I have noticed that from, like I said, decade and a half ago, me and 3 other people thought virtual reality was a good idea. Now there's tens of thousands of people who think it's a good idea. Most of them are scientists, you see. That's in a decade, decade and a half. That's a lot. It's gone up by, 100,000% more people. Well, that's pretty big. So I'm thinking in another decade and a half from now, we will already have gotten to the point where virtual reality is the answer. Yes, we're a subset of something bigger and it's non-physical. And suddenly all the stuff that's paranormal and the meditation and the out of body, it all starts to make sense. That's what science does. Science takes things that used to be mystical and non-understandable and turns them into things that are normal and understandable. That's what science has always done, right? From, why do we have 4 seasons? Well, that was mystical because God gave us 4 seasons is why we have them. But no, we find out it's because the Earth has a axis on an angle and it goes around the sun, and different parts of the Earth, are in the sunshine and in the shade at different times. So science makes things that used to be mystical normal. That's what it's going to do with the paranormal. We're going to understand how remote viewing works. It's just getting data out of a database. Healing. Oh, yeah, intent modifies future probability. And all this stuff will start to make sense once we get this bigger picture. And when that does, you see, we're in a whole different probability space now. Right now, we, collective consciousness, have a very limited set of choices of where we can go because our beliefs and our fears limit us. When our beliefs get shattered by virtual reality and the new science, then we'll still have all those fears to deal with, and that'll be a little rough. But I think we have a chance in 2-3 decades of turning this thing around to where people become aware of themselves as individuated units of consciousness that are here to grow up and become love. That would make a huge difference, a really huge difference. So it wouldn't be just you and I talking about this. It would be you and I and 800 million other people would be doing the same things that we're doing, you see, and that will change everything. Then the other, 6 billion will come along. They'll come along for the ride. They'll do what everybody else does. And suddenly, they'll be into it too. They'll be thinking about it and doing it and taking responsibility, and that'll just be the thing to do. So that's the way I see it coming. So yeah, I think on the horizon, we've got all the elements together. First time ever. So it's just when is it all going to happen? What's going to be the thing that kicks it off and it all happens? But I think those physicists who come out with virtual reality are going to be what kicks it off, because they're in the position as the high priests to get everybody's attention, because we know science only speaks truth. We believe that, Scientists are believers just like everybody else. They have a belief in materialism, and it's hard to get that, those cracks are in there, but it's hard to tear that apart. That's going to be the first big paradigm shift, is to finally, put the rest is belief in materialism. But scientists will tell you materialism doesn't work. I mean, most of them still will claim they're materialists, but they see it coming apart and it doesn't work, and it frightens them some. That's why they're dragging their feet, but they can't hold it back. You see, that's the thing about truth. Eventually, it rises to the top.